tonight are honored to have Trevor Burrus as a speaker to talk about the primitivism of politics. Before we begin, though, I'd like to talk about a little bit about SFL for those of you who don't know a lot about our organization, and then a little bit about the webinar series. So SFL is a 501c3 nonprofit. It's run for students and completely by students, dedicated to spread the ideas of liberty. We were formed about 5 years ago to fill a widely wanted need in our universities, and that is connecting pro-liberty students to other students, other faculty, organizations, and resources, obviously to help them advance their ideas and their applications of classical liberalism. We also offer incredible resources, and I could sit here all night talking about those, but I really like Trevor and his talk, so I'm just going to talk to you about one of them, and that is the one that we launched today, the Objectivist Initiative Kits. Those are awesome for tabling on campus. They include a Who is John Galt banner, objectivist stickers, buttons, handouts of why read Ayn Rand. Those come from the Atlas Society. We also have bottle openers and copies of Morality of Capitalism. Those are just a few of the things that you get. And you can actually request those online at the SFL website, and it's at no cost to you or to your group. So that's something, that's an opportunity for all of you. The webinar series, the goal for it is to be an educational tool, interactive educational program to provide students with access to lectures relating to liberty, mentoring on activism, and career building. And that is all virtual access because all of our leaders and students are all over the world, so this is a great way to spread the ideas as well. Okay, so now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. His name is Trevor Burrus. He's a research fellow at the Cato Institute, Center for Constitutional Studies. His research interests include constitutional law, civil and criminal law, legal and political philosophy, and legal history. His work has appeared in the Vermont Law Review, the Syracuse Law Review, the Jurist, as well as the Washington Times, Huffington Post, the Daily Caller, the Harvard the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and the USA Today. He's all over the map. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Colorado Boulder and a JD from the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Just one note before we start, there will be about a 15-minute question and answer period at the end of the webinar, so feel free to type in your questions in the question box, and I will pick which ones will be asked. We'll be also sending you an email to follow up this webinar with information about internships and the Liberty Movement. And that's it. Without further ado, here is Trevor.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. It's great to be here. In addition to being at the Cato Institute, I am honored to be on the Alumni for Liberty board. I am a very big fan of SFL, and I know just about, well, I feel like I know everyone in the organization, but that gets smaller and smaller as the organization gets bigger. So my talk tonight is going to be about why politics sucks in the most basic sense. Now, I'm going to explain why it sucks in a different way than a lot of people explain how it sucks, because possibly some of you know about public choice theory, and to say that politics is not a very good way of amalgamating our preferences or depending on people to do what they say they're going to do. I agree with all of that, and this is another aspect of politics, qua politics, that I think is very, very damaging to society. Sometimes when people ask me what kind of libertarian I am, which, you know, Carlos had mentioned the objectivist stuff, and there's all different types of libertarians, and sometimes I just say I'm against politics. And I've been into libertarianism since I was a teenager, but I've always been against politics. Even though I was reading everything about libertarianism, and I watched, you know, Bill Clinton or something like that, I just thought, this is problematic. This is a bad way of doing things. So yes, the primitivism of politics and how politicization creates a status-based society that undermines both law and the state. So just to begin, we'll talk about my objectives. We're going to think about politics as a different method for producing outcomes. It's maybe better or maybe worse, but at least different. This is an important point because if this is the way we think about this, we don't have to be actually partisan. We don't have to be libertarian to say that politics is a different way of choosing things. The market chooses certain outcomes, and politics has different outcomes. And each one So you see here, they have different traits that they prefer over other traits. If you win in the political game, you have different traits than if you win. And I'm making air quotes here, which doesn't work, of course, but if you win in the market game. And so what makes people in the politics game, quote unquote, win? And I think it's certain traits that we'll talk about coming forward, and in my opinion, if you win in the political game, the traits that you have to exhibit ultimately are primitive traits. And next thing we're going to see, again, as I said, that the market distribution also prefers certain traits over other traits. We're not going to produce a perfect world at any point. We're never going to produce this sort of Rawlsian world where all things that you deserve are given to you and nothing you don't deserve is given to you. We're going to try and produce a world in which different distributions are actualized and different people gain in those distributions. In my opinion, the political distribution method is horrible. And again, this is an important point. There's an essay I wrote about this on libertarianism.org, which you can find on my page there, where I think this is a very important point. If you think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, you think about the Tea Party movement, they actually kind of said some of the same things, a very big chasm in the middle, but some of the same things involving whether or not the government was serving their goals. The Tea Party had accused government of cronyism, and so did the Occupy Wall Street movement. But for the Occupy Wall Street movement, if you walked to them and said, hey, you should think about the market, you should think about capitalism, they're thinking about big business. They're thinking about banks. They're thinking about huge corporations, and that's not something that they're a part of. And you go to the Tea Party people and you say, oh, you should think about the market, and they say, oh, that's something I'm a part of. I'm not a part of government. The short form of this is that sometimes you feel like you participate in something. You participate in the political system. You have a perception of meaningful participation in the political system. A vote gives you a perception of participation. And sometimes you have a perception of meaningful participation in the market system. For example, your dollars that you decide where to spend. But if you don't feel like you're participating in that system, then the system is the other. And libertarians are the kind of people who think of the state as the other. Most other political classes say the state is us, and we say, no, 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 the state is other. The state is something totally different. Well, that's exactly what the Occupy Wall Street people believe about the market. And if we say the market is us to the Occupy Wall Street people, they look at us like we're crazy. They say, no, the market is a bunch of fat cat bankers carrying bags with dollar signs on them and getting kickbacks from government. So I think that's an important point to remember throughout this lecture. And one last point before I move on to this picture here is another way of thinking about this talk is to think about the communitarian impulse which is emerging in modern political life. The communitarian impulse is the you didn't build that impulse. The Elizabeth Warren and Barack Obama said it too. It's the you didn't build that. And they always talk about how you didn't grow up alone and you depended on other people, and that's obviously true. What does not follow from that is that the political system is the way of instantiating communitarian ideas. So another way of thinking about this lecture is to say simply that politics does not make us communitarian. Politics makes us primitive. And so here's a good example of what politics is to me. This is a man named Mohamed Bouazizi. Mohamed Bouazizi is often credited with starting the Arab Spring of 2010-2011. He was a Tunisian salesman. He ran a fruit cart on the corner in Tunis, Tunisia. And he was constantly harassed by politicized government regulators who were trying to make sure that he ran his life in the way that they thought he should run it. And a lot of these things included making sure that his cart was this far away from the curb, or other sorts of draconian regulations that occur in this country too. The Institute for Justice just won an important case about food trucks in D.C., a similar type of thing. But Mohamed Bouazizi was a very poor man. All he had was really his work, the things he could sell to support his family. And one day a regulator came along, a government regulator empowered by the government, I'm sure a very nice person, and she wrote him a citation for violating some silly law, and she confiscated all of his wares and basically impoverished him. So in response to that, Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, something that we generally only associate with Vietnam in the famous picture on the cover of the Rage Against the Machine album, for any fans of Rage Against the Machine, that why would you ever set yourself on fire for something as mundane as trying to earn a living? And that's kind of funny, because actually trying to earn a living is something that is not mundane at all, and for him it sapped his streak. This is the president of Tunisia, consoling him, and he later died. He did not survive his injuries. That's politics to me. His life was politicized. His ability to earn a living was politicized. And we're going to talk about why and what the effects of that are. Something else that is politics, well, this is the woman who confiscated his wares, a very nice and now very sad woman who was just doing her job. And all these political people are always just doing their job. We don't need to demonize political actors to pursue a libertarian objective. Actually, I would implore you not to demonize political actors. No part of the libertarian thesis requires saying that people in politics are bad people, and she's certainly not a bad person. She was just doing her job. The problem is her job. Here's another example of politics. These are Greeks bearing gifts. This is how politics is accomplished in Greece now. This is how you get what you want. If you want an education, if you want a pension, if you want to retire nicely, if you want to have a job, and the youth unemployment rate in Greece is, of course, astronomical as it is throughout Europe, you need to throw things at people. An ultimate example of primitivism. This is the sort of end goal, the end result of the state as I see it, is this type of fighting over things. So this is the kind of tribalism I'm talking about. This is the man who made them into tribal warriors. Well, a lot of people did. But he was the prime minister of Greece who was elected, George Papandreou. He was elected in 2009, and he was on a very populist campaign. His campaign slogan is, "There is money." And of course what he meant was, there is other people's money that I can take and give to you, and of course to get that money you're going to have to form a tribe and fight over it and possibly throw things in the street. Another example of politics, this is Britain looking for a free education. Of course the idea of a free education is a total misnomer. There is no such thing. They're looking for an education that other people pay for, which may be something that we want. That's a different conversation. I don't think we should, but we should at least be clear about what we're talking about. We're not ever talking about a free education. Education is something, you could replace all this. Education is something that other people should pay for me. Free education, other people should pay for my education. And how do you fight for other people's goods? Well, you got to take to the streets, because people, well, they kind of tend to hold on to their goods sometimes. And possibly here's the ultimate example of politics, North Korea. This was the best sort of mass picture of North Korea I could find, possibly the apotheosis of the political state. Everything is politically controlled. Nothing is controlled by the market. The only way you can possibly succeed is to court the right people, to know the right people, to have the right groups, and of course even then you're not going to succeed very well in that state. So I have some theses here, which I've already stated in various different ways, but here's another way of putting it. If the more areas of life the political decision-making controls, the more that succeeding in life, which I just define as getting what you want, depends on your ability to act politically rather than communally through the market or otherwise. That seems obviously true. A non-libertarian should not actually object to that thesis. If you need to get something out of the political system, then you need to be able to act politically. And that includes voting and organizing. These are all the things that if you go on your campus and you see the people who aren't libertarians talking about what you need to do, it's start a group, get an organization, make your voice heard. They're always thinking politically, and that's exactly what they're talking about. But what actually comes from that is not equality. It is the opposite of equality, and it's the opposite of freedom. It's a status-based society. Your ability to act politically is a status-based society, and it's a primitive society built on relations rather than law. And we're going to go into more of what I mean by relations rather than law, but for this part right here, it's who you know and what you're able to do and what groups you belong to is more and more determining your ability to live your life in the way you want to live it. And that entire concept undermines the rule of law. The rule of law, for its virtues and possible limitations, at least is an idea that similar people should be treated similarly. The distinctions that are made by the state in these political societies are fundamentally arbitrary. They are not rooted in any moral categorization. But this is a problem because the rule of law is a justification, if not legitimation of the state. A state that is just power is a state that just gives things out, takes things and gives things out to people who are properly able to court the state. And I'm going to finish with a little bit of discussion of the Constitution. It was partially constructed to avoid these problems, but it is largely being ignored. We'll talk about that when we get to the end. But first, what do I mean by politics? Well, maybe some people know this picture. Perhaps not, because Simpsons has not been good since about 1999. This is King and Kodos, a awesome Simpsons episode where these two space aliens run against each other, and it's just your vote is between two aliens. All I really mean right now in politics is voting is sufficient to talk about voting over things. In the democratic world, in the Western world, voting is good enough for what I mean by politics. More specifically, voting about or acting politically over things that were voted over to try and get what you want out of the world, as opposed to other ways you can get what you want out of the world. This is an important quote. No one has to really focus too much on this, but we can send out the slides later. This is a very interesting book, and the only really important part is the bolded part at the end. This is when I do this to law schools, I focus more on this. A very classic observation that the difference between a primitive society and a non-primitive society is that a primitive society is run by status and not contract. And what does that mean? Well, in a primitive society, who you are, who you know, your ability to know the chief, whether or not you're the chief's son, that's your status, and that determines whether or not you get certain things. In this last line, the movement of progressive societies has hitherto been a movement from status to contract. The really interesting thing about contracts is that person A and person B are just persons for that. It doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter who you know, you can just trade with them as a person. And that really optimizes your ability to make trades, which is pretty much synonymous with your ability to be wealthy. You can trade with more people if it's a contract society. A status-based society is a primitive society. But we can go further into this idea. We talked about roles, we talked about who you know. All these things are functions of our current world. And I'm here in Washington, D.C., well, in Arlington. I'm in the Beltway. And trust me, this town is basically the Hobbesian world in suits. It's still primitive, we just dress nicer. So yes, it's status-based, as I just said. The status is conferred by various things. That changes over time. Group affiliation, walk down the street in Washington, and about every third building you will see the National Carpenters Association, the National Pharmacists Association. These are people who can't get anything done without a group, and more specifically, without a building in Washington. Personal relations. We have the revolving door of government and agencies. We have a huge problem with the simple fact that if you create an agency to regulate concrete, the only people who know how to regulate concrete are concrete manufacturers. So you inevitably create a symbiotic, parasitic on society, but symbiotic for them, relationship between the concrete regulators and the people who work in concrete. This is, of course, the Timothy Geithner Goldman Sachs story, all of the financial system over the last 5 years. It's an inevitable part of this entire system we have. Don't think it's a feature. Don't think it's a bug. Understand that it's a feature. Goal-oriented. Now, what I mean by this is that the groups are seeking an outcome for the entire group. So the groups work in goal-oriented fashion to try and reach a goal that the group will figure out together. They're not individualistic. It's goal-oriented by the group. And those goals are zero-sum. If you get it, the other people don't. It's a basic fact of politics, one of the reasons why it is so primitive. You want to make people fight over something like a bunch of craven tribal warriors, have them fight over the national definition of birth control. Because if you win, the other people lose. And we have codependency. This is part of the group-orientedness. You can't get anything done without your trade association of the carpenters, the pharmacists, or the marionettists, or whatever. And you get gifts from the chief. This is a very important part of a primitive society. If you know the chief, if you're able to interact with the chief, you can get gifts from the chiefs. Gifts from the chief are different types of things. They can be dispensations, exemptions, or waivers. One of the best things you can get from the chief is a waiver that says you don't have to comply with some new law. And if you pay attention to Washington at all, that is about half of what we do here. In Obamacare, for example, they've been shooting out waivers for businesses like they're printing money, or maybe maybe even more so, but I don't know if that's possible. You give a waiver to someone for not complying, and how do they get the waiver? Why do they get the waiver? Generally because they know someone and they are part of a group that is goal-oriented, that seeks a zero-sum result for themselves. But there's another possibility. It doesn't have to be this way. We could have a law-governed state, which would be a lot better. It would be part of an Enlightenment era type of tradition, which America was founded in, which the Greeks talked about. As, for example, Aristotle, a rightly constituted law should be the final sovereign. And this is very important because Aristotle is talking about law as not as a use of force or a mandate backed up by the use of force, as the legal positivists would say, but a law as a thing that requires a moral element to it. If you just tell someone to do something and you back it up with force, it is not a law, according to Aristotle's view. So that is what a rightly constituted law is. And the personal rule, whether or not it be exercised by a single person or a body of persons, should be sovereign only in those matters in which law is unable, owing to the difficulty of framing general rules for all contingencies, to make an exact pronouncement. Essentially, Aristotle is saying here that if you can't make a general rule that applies to everyone, you're not making a law. And individual people are fully allowed to operate without rules, to make arbitrary discriminations between redheads and brunettes or whoever, but the state is not, and that is not a law if it does. Also, we have good old St. Thomas Aquinas here. 3 parts of a law: it has an end, it has an author, and it has a form. The end is the common good, the important point being common. Similar to what Aristotle said, it has to be a universal rule, a general rule. The author has powers that are given to him in some way, and the form is, again, common, and its burdens are laid upon subjects in due proportion. But we can talk about more highfalutin jurisprudence later. But the politically governed state is not anything like this, right? It's governed by influence. It's preferred voices, media. There are always preferred voices. It doesn't matter how you try to level the playing field. The New York Times is a preferred voice. If you're really good at giving speeches, it's a preferred voice. That's how you can influence people. The ability, do you have the ability to keep up with the laws, to know the laws? This is very important. The lawyers in this town, and there are thousands if not millions of lawyers in this town, spend most of their time, about 85% of them, just keeping up with the pages of the Federal Register. One of the most important lessons to know about the laws in this country is that being able to keep up with the laws is always a competitive advantage to someone who can't. So Walmart has a cadre of lawyers. They can keep up with the laws. Little mom and pop store that might be better than Walmart but is trying to compete against them, they simply cannot keep up with the laws. So that is the ability of Walmart to keep up with the laws. That's what helps them succeed after they get this big. Access, we talked about this, Timothy Geithner and concrete makers and everyone else. This is another way that things are decided in a politically governed state. This is how things are distributed. And exemptions, waivers, and dispensations. Again, we talked about that. You get a waiver, you get an exemption, you get a dispensation. You're always trying for that. Now, the Bill of Rights, that's the reason that it's listed here, is because that is actually an entire bill of exemptions. When we get to the Constitution part, we'll have a better understanding of what that means and how we live in a backwards, constitutionally backwards world. And of course, group membership, that is the other thing that governs this. So this next part's going to get kind of abstract. So we're gonna follow me here. The question here is, where is politics not allowed? And that's a funny question. All of us can probably answer that to some extent. Like, for example, your haircut. If we were all going to get together and vote about your haircut, you would say politics is not allowed here. Or how you decorate your house. Or how you paint your house, possibly. There are many exceptions to that. But there's always a question about where politics is not allowed and how we deal with that and why politics is not allowed in certain situations is a fascinating question and really kind of the heart of this talk. So we can talk about different groups of, I'm going to talk about something called zones of autonomy. And they're not rights. They're rights on some level, but this is a person. This is a red-headed person. I'm a redhead, so I like my red-headed people. And he has a zone of autonomy. I'm just going to generally call that the area of his concern, right? This is where he is in control. What he wears, how he styles his hair, if he wants a tattoo or not, that is all within his zone of autonomy. And one of the ways that we do a really good job of living together is that we understand that there are zones of autonomy all over the place, and generally we respect them pretty well. We stay out of each other's way. We know we're not supposed to step on each other's foot. We know we're not supposed to, take a huge interest in what tattoos people get. We can comment on them and make fun of them, but it's not our right to say that they can't get a tattoo because it's within the zone of autonomy. So generally we do a pretty good job of living together, and even when there's other people who aren't redheads, people who are purple, they're also living in zones of autonomy of various sort. But it's not just individualistically based. You can put a group together and have a similar type of idea. This could be like, for example, a gated community. A gated community gets together and has a zone of autonomy where they decide things together, and within that area they politicize various things and vote on certain things. That could also be a state, a United States, like a state in the United States, which is the next slide here. Take a bunch of these together. This could be a locality, this could be a municipality, this could be a state, and they all live together, and they all have their zones of autonomy. Who controls what and where? Why does Wyoming have jurisdiction over something and Colorado doesn't? Well, it's basically this type of graph we're seeing right here. And we could put them all together, and then we could put another zone of autonomy around something, and that could be the federal government. This is essentially a graph of the United States or the EU or many other federally controlled districts, Canada, Australia, Germany, whatever. We have individuals with zones of autonomy grouping together into other collections, with putting another ruling area around that, living with those people, and then possibly another ruling area on top of that. But the reason I bring this up is because generally the presumption is that an individual has a zone of autonomy, and if it's your tattoo or if it's your haircut or whatever, you're not allowed to enter into this zone of autonomy, or in other words, you're not allowed to politicize it. Any sort of political group, any sort of state group is not allowed to politicize that zone of autonomy. If they say they want to vote about your tattoos, you simply say, hey man, like GTFO, no one is voting about my tattoos because it's within my sphere. But sometimes we do something different. Sometimes we politicize what goes on in our own bodies, on our own bodies, within our own zones. And why do we do that? Why do we add politics to this equation? So there's two general reasons. One is because we think that the effects of something leaks outside of the zone. So these are my effects arrows to show the effects of something leaks outside the zone. So, for example, nudity, public nudity. You could make a claim that no one is allowed to decide whether or not you have to wear clothes, but the theory of why they can decide whether or not you have to wear clothes when you're in certain areas is because the effects of you being naked are not contained within you. That's one example, and if you start thinking along those lines, you'll think of a ton other examples. And this, of course, doesn't just apply to individuals. Oh, no, actually, the second question, I went a little ahead of myself, is what are the reasons why we allow people to get inside the zone and regulate it? Well, I think there are generally two. I mentioned one, that the effects leak outside the zone, as in the nudity example. The other possible example is that it's just wrong. And that's what this skull and crossbones represents, that it's just wrong. We don't care about effects. It's just wrong. So, for example, we could have this also with broader ideas, your property. We're talking about zones of autonomy again. This is bigger than rights. It's more about governance and the ability to control. But even within your property, there's a zone of autonomy. And the exact same theory applies. When could they decide to tell you how to paint your house? What would be the theory of control that would allow them to tell you how to paint your house? Well, one of them would be that the effects leak outside and everyone else is offended by your hot pink or fuchsia house, and so you need to, they're allowed to control what goes on inside the zone merely because the effects leak outside. Or they could bring up the evil example too. But what is a really good example of this? Well, I think maybe what everyone should be thinking of is drugs. what are the theories by which drugs are regulated? Drugs seem to be, on first glance, something like tattoos, something that they wouldn't be allowed to control without a good reason. But someone could say, hey, when you do drugs, you might hit your wife, or you might not be a productive member of society, or you might corrupt the young, or whatever. All of those explanations are effects outside of the zone of explanations. That your doing drugs is not contained entirely to you. You could drive drunk, or you could drive stoned, or whatever. All of those are effects explanations. Another example of something like this is the pure evil of the Family Guy. We'll get to politicization of your house and your television in a second, but I can tell you that Family Guy and the regulation of Family Guy works on the exact same two principles as drugs. And those two principles are these, what I just went over: why we interfere with the zone of autonomy, types of political interference, why do we politicize our lives in so many different ways, what are the theories that make us do this. There's the effects-driven theory. This is the theory that things leak out. Communitarianism is based on this theory. No man is an island. You didn't build that. So because you are not an island, and because you affect so many other things, we can take control of you in almost anything. And modern leftism is very into this. But global warming, that's a good example. Why do they regulate your light bulbs? Why are they going to prohibit your light bulbs? Or they already have prohibited incandescent light bulbs, because the effects of your light bulbs leak outside of the house. Obamacare, we'll get to that more specifically. Same exact theory. The other possibility is it's ethics-driven. This is the skull and crossbones. Why do we prohibit drugs? Well, you could give a communitarian theory to that on one level, which is that we prohibit drugs because you're not contributing to the community. Or we could just give the conservative explanation on the right here, which is it's just wrong. It's just wrong to take drugs. That is all I need to say. It is completely ethically wrong to take drugs. Also, modern leftism has many of these elements to it. Michael Sandel has a book that came out recently where he just sort of complains about everything that people buy. It's a really interesting rant about the fact that he doesn't like that people buy skyboxes at stadiums and HOV lane passes, that there are people who can buy this, and for some reason it's a bad thing. And he's just as moralistic as Rick Santorum or any conservative. He just thinks that some of these things are just wrong to do. Buying organs, that's another example. Just wrong. No one should do it. But why do we need zones of autonomy? That's sort of the point of the whole lecture here. One thing you can think about is if we don't have them, the basic point of the lecture is that if we don't have zones of autonomy, all we have is politics. That's it, nothing else. We have politics about our house, about our haircuts, about our tattoos, about our family raising habits, about our localities. All we have is politics. If we have no concept of a zone of autonomy, we live in only a political world. Obamacare, going back to what I mentioned previously, Obamacare was entirely premised on the theory that they could make you buy health insurance by virtue of the fact that you not having health insurance, the effects of that leak outside of your zone. That was the entire, what lawyers would call, jurisdictional hook of Obamacare. If you don't have health insurance, even if you never get sick, you might get sick, and then the effects of that leak outside the zone. You might get hit by a bus tomorrow. So that's how the government took control of you in Obamacare. But what other things do we have here? Oh, the big soda ban. This is a really funny one. Did anyone else have a hard time keeping a straight face when conservatives were saying, or simultaneously saying, making fun of the big soda ban while trying to prohibit drugs? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The left is justifying the big soda ban based on the effects-driven hypothesis. I think there is some part of the ethics-driven hypothesis too. There's some sort of consumerism, the ghost, the specter of consumerism. But there's also the health thing about drinking too much soda will put your healthcare costs onto other people. And so they're regulated in that way. And the conservatives laughed at that, but of course they have the exact same theory about drugs. There is no difference in principle between these two sides. There's only a difference in details and degree and what facts they happen to believe. But neither of them are really espousing a principle that it is not okay to regulate these things that go into your body. And of course, the left has the advantage in this sense of the more that they politicize healthcare, the more that they are able to give a colorable argument that one guy drinking a soda affects everyone else. But how else do they politicize parts of your life? What else is politicized in your life, and why? Well, we talked about the great evil, the FCC, and the Family Guy. The FCC is an agency, like all the agencies in this town, with an incredible amount of discretion to run your life for no very good reason. One of them, this is the reason that they issue licenses for broadcasters to broadcast in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. This is still what it says. They could decide tomorrow that you're not broadcasting in the public interest if you have a license and just take it away. And of course, they only do this with broadcast television, which is that stuff that you get through the antenna and not through cable. And there was recently a Supreme Court case about that that was very interesting. But the idea here is that broadcast television itself, because you pick it up with an antenna, it leaks inside of the zone by virtue of what it is. You can't confine it outside of the zone. So they have to regulate it at the beginning because it just is pervasive throughout all of the zones, individual property, states, localities, all over the place. But then we get the Parents Television Council. And the thing here is that the FCC decided that they had control over your zone. They had control over a small part of what happens in your zone, mainly what you watch. And they're going to let people fight about what you're allowed to watch because they've taken control over this based on the effects-driven hypothesis. And the Parents Television Council comes in and says, this is a great opportunity for us to control what everyone else watches and sees. And so what do? They do the primitive thing. They form a tribe, and they fight with you, unbeknownst to you possibly, over what you are allowed to watch. So their tribe is a very well-organized tribe with a website that lets them submit complaints to the FCC pretty much on demand. They have a little bit over 1 million members last time I checked, and every time they see something they don't like, they send out an email that says submit a complaint to the FCC, and this is how your television is decided. It is politicized, and it is based on the effects-driven hypothesis because the Parents Television Council believes that if people watch bad things, they're going to be bad citizens, I think mostly. There's also the ethics-driven hypothesis there. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's exactly what they do. These are complaints to the FCC in early 2000s. That's how many complaints they got in June of 2003, 242 total complaints about all television everywhere. And then the ultimate evil happens, and that is, of course, an episode of The Family Guy, and the Parents Television Council decides that they must stop this because they have a tribe and you don't, and they're going to fight over your politicized broadcasting spectrum. And so they send out the missive to put every complaint in, and the next month they get 5,552 complaints, which is an exponential increase. And suddenly the FCC says, wow, this is kind of crazy. And they keep doing this. This is actually one of the reasons that the Family Guy was originally canceled, is because 1 million or so angry parents who have a well-formed tribe decided that you shouldn't watch it. So again, my favorite one is this one, August of 2004, 922 complaints. And then some episode of Family Guy aired, best I've been able to figure out, it had something to do with horse semen, if anyone knows what this episode is. And then the next time, there were 120,000 complaints from the Parents Television Council. That's the tribe right there. I imagine you did not submit a letter to the FCC explaining why you wanted the Family Guy to be on the air, because that doesn't happen. That is the tribe that is fighting over what your airwaves are going to look like. But of course, it's sort of bizarre. It didn't really have to be like this. We had this idea that Congress would have like an area it controlled, and that's what my circle is for there. It's an area that Congress controls. And there's only about 18 of these powers that Congress has in the Constitution that delineate what it's allowed to do. And if you're not in that area, then you generally should not be within the power of Congress. But if you start coming up with these effects-driven theories, these theories that everything affects everything else, then these barriers start to go away. We can't all live together in this nice thing where we're sticking to ourselves, we're keeping to ourselves, we're not trying to run each other's lives, we're not trying to run each other's property. It goes away. Instead, we have something more like that. Congress's power doesn't really look like a circle anymore. It looks like a huge net that we all live inside because of these theories by politicizing your entire life. And these things just start to go away. Property rights are kind of out the window. Your individual autonomy is out the window as soon as they decided, for example, that they could fight a drug war that's not constitutionally authorized. All of these things are politicizing your life. And this is a really, really bad situation for many, many people. And what I mean particularly are these people up here. This is Mr. Blue. Now, Mr. Blue could be anything you want him to be. He could be an individual who likes alternative medicine. He just has his own little way of doing medicine, and he doesn't have a group. He's not like the Reds down here. He doesn't have a group that helps him organize and fight against this huge net of congressional regulation that is no longer letting him live his life. He doesn't have a tribe. He's just a person. He's an individual. As Ayn Rand said, the most important minority is the minority of one. And that man is sort of left out in the cold because he can't play the primitivism of politics game. And there's so many examples of this, and we'll get to some more specific ones. But if you watch the political news, you can start seeing how many of the blues are just left out in the cold because they're not part of a tribe. It's even worse than this, though. We have a national system where the federal government is taking over more and more things on more and more of a level. So whereas if these were all states, you could fight this battle possibly easier if you were in one of these states that were trying to control your life. Now the federal government is taking everything. They're over the top of everything. And yeah, there are Reds everywhere. There are Reds distributed about. These might be Catholics, for example. Catholics have their own interests, their own things they want to do, and they would like to carve exemptions out for themselves and have different waivers. We'll get to the birth control issue here in a second. And so yeah, they're Reds. They can get together. They have those traits that we talked about at the beginning. They have ability. They can organize. They have spokespeople. They have access to lawmakers, and they have enough numbers to make a difference to be able to fight this endless tribal game of politics. But again, we have these blues, the poor blues, for whatever thing you want to say that they are, who want to live their life in their own way, and they're not going to get those exemptions. And they're going to be on other parts of the country too, not being able to form a tribe. So let's start talking more about what I mean by blues and Reds. So this is a picture of an organization called ACT UP that came into Washington in the late 80s. So pretty much it's gay men. So right in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, when the FDA was insisting that AIDS drugs that were experimental, I mean, AIDS at that time would kill you very quickly, very quickly. Within a month, it would shrivel you up and die. And the FDA was prohibiting drugs based on effectiveness research. Basically, they were still playing their same old game of trying to guarantee the effectiveness of drugs, and they were telling gay men who had no hope, no drug whatsoever, that they could not take this drug that would give them even a 10% chance of life, but it was better than that, that they had to wait for the FDA to approve this. Well, gays have a pretty good history of getting together and organizing, and they did this very well. And they marched on Washington. They actually shut down the FDA, blocked it up, and they were able to get an exemption from Congress. And this exemption just came through their political action. But if you think about the picture that we had of the Greeks at the beginning, of the Greeks, as I said, bearing gifts, this isn't as violent. but it's still the type of action that you have to do in this politicized world to figure out what kind of drugs you are allowed to take to stop you from dying. They had a tribe. They're the Reds in this situation. Who are the Blues? Well, this is a woman, a girl. She's 21 in this picture, or 20, I think. Abigail Burrus. Abigail Burrus died of cancer in the late 90s. She was 21 when she died, and she was prohibited by the FDA from using a drug that had been approved for brain cancer on a type of skeletal cancer that she had. She sued about this, saying that I have a right to try and extend my life against the FDA's mandate, and she lost. She didn't have a group to march on Washington. She didn't have an interest group. She was just Abigail Burrus trying to sue. And of course, by itself, the suing is primitive too, correct? The suing itself is an act of trying. To sue someone, you have to form a tribe by itself, and you're still looking for that exemption, for that waiver, for that exception to the power of the FDA so you can live your life. She is a blue. And some people say, oh, wow, like the communitarian impulse. It's like, it doesn't have to be this way. Politics doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to have these zones. We can all live together as a fluid type of commune. We can all hold hands. We can all discuss. We can have direct democracy. We can have down tinkles and up tinkles, if anyone knows about the Occupy Wall Street stuff. And we can vote. Voting is the best way of doing this stuff. And we can all get together and we can all live a nice life. And we'll include the Blues, the Abigail Burrus, the people who like alternative medicine. They can come too. They can be fully respected in the group. And they say it's not going to be bad. It's not going to be like a net of regulation. It's going to be direct democracy, direct action, human beings living together, having equal say in everything. It won't be that. It's going to be super awesome. It's going to be like unicorns and nice little like palatial valleys, and we'll all live together and nice. And even the Blues can come. The Blues will get exemptions and waivers. It'll be like affirmative action. You just got to make sure you're blue and they'll bring you in. And they say it's not going to be like that. I say that's not right. It's going to be like this. It has to merely do with the functions of politics and what makes you succeed politically, and also with the gains and the costs of politics, with what you can get out of it. If we're going to, the simple fact is that the government can never actually be as nuanced as the market. If we're going to get together and decide our national health care program, if we're going to choose that politically, there's not going to be a place for everyone in that if the government is choosing it. It's going to be, even if there's one size fits all at the worst, but even if it's 40 sizes fits all, that's still not enough to account for the multifarious possibilities of humanity. And so we're left with a political world that is fundamentally a dehumanizing world. And if you want to know how dehumanizing it is, just ask Abigail Burrus about how dehumanizing it is, or anyone who lives in this crazy nation here, North Korea. The waivers, like what Abigail Burrus was looking for, this is what Blues are out there trying to look for. But even to get a waiver, you need to have a tribe, and these are everywhere. I won't go into the nuances of administrative law, but the problem with administrative law is that we imbue these agencies, we give them political power to politicize our entire life, and then we give them the ability to just arbitrarily decide stuff, and then we go to them and ask them to exempt us from this for various purposes. Dodd-Frank is going to be maybe the worst law ever passed, although it's a close running, of course. The ACA, which is Obamacare, the whole thing is going to be waivers. And we'll talk about birth control in a second here. That's the first one, but more and more waivers are coming up to try and get a waiver through your tribe, through political action. The Radio Act 1927, I like that one because that was one of the first times that the government totally took over the radio spectrum and started issuing licenses. And as soon as they did that, Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Transportation at the time, he immediately started just giving licenses to his friends because he was the chief and they were the ones who knew him, and politics is primitive. Or this one's a good one too, construction and real estate development. There are many cities in America right now where if you go to the local city council and you ask them for a permit to just build your house, an extra room on your house, they will deny you that permit until you, I don't know, build a public pool or improve a park, because they're looking for a waiver or an exemption. They will waive the red tape if you do this thing for them. This is completely primitive and completely tribal. This is the best example of it recently, and it's recently been in the news because Obama tried to amend his draconian one-size-fits-all regulation about the institutions that don't have to comply with the birth control mandate. And if no one knows what I'm talking about here, Obamacare, in defining our national health care plan, has parts about having to supply birth control. And for religious employers, they were very, very against this. And so eventually they gave them a waiver that said if you're a church, you don't have to comply. But then there were universities, religious universities, that said, well, what about us? And so they were looking for the waiver again. Again, that the simple fact that politics can never be as nuanced as the world is, as the market world is, as the communal world is. And so recently they came out with another rule that exempted certain other types of employees. But there are other people out there whose rights of conscience are being violated all the time. The Catholics were the ones who brought this originally. When I talked about the Reds in that one example, the Catholics are the Reds. And they are lucky because they have a First Amendment, they have political power, they have spokespeople, they have all of these things that let you succeed politically. But what about these people who don't have these Hindus, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientologists, Ayurvedic medicine, just someone who's morally opposed to Western medicine in general, who is now going to have to pay for it in a variety of ways? Where is their waiver? They don't have one because they are not a part of a sufficiently large tribe to make their preferences actualized, so they're SOL. Another good example, Romney Care, the part of Obamacare, the blueprint for Obamacare. Well, they figured out in Massachusetts that the healthcare costs were spiraling out of control. So voila, they just de-enrolled 40,000 legal immigrants from Romney Care to save costs. Why did they de-enroll that tribe, that group of people? Well, because they aren't voters, for one. That was a good reason. But so that was the insufficient political power. But they eventually were able to sue, and they were able to overturn this determination as a discrimination against them as immigrants. But again, is that what we want? Is that a right to health care? When people talk about a right to health care and the ability of the government to just decide that you no longer have it anymore because you don't have enough political power, because you aren't a tribe that is properly organized to fight for that, that is not a right to health care. That is chaos. And that's what the important thing about rights here. I'm going to give a quick synopsis of this. There are positive rights and negative rights. Some rights are positive. Those things are claims that other people have to give you something. And some rights are negative, and those are claims that other people have to refrain from something. And so in the positive rights situation, right to health care would be a right for someone else to provide you health care. And if you remember back at the beginning of this talk, that's exactly what the claim for education is, and fighting over that. And if you're talking about a right to life in a negative rights sense, that is a right for other people not to kill you. It's a very important distinction in modern politics. Everyone has a right to not have them kill you, but a right to have people take care of you is merely a resource allocation problem. And if you want to read the essay that really formulated this idea, it's by a guy named Leslie Newcomb-Holfeld. But if there's a positive right is merely a resource allocation problem. It's a claim to resources without the possibility of producing more resources. You simply give someone a voucher for something. You give them a voucher for health care, and you say all of you have health care now, but there is not enough health care to satisfy those rights, and then it becomes fundamentally primitive. What I mean by this in the most basic sense is if you have 3 ice cream cones and there are 4 people with free ice cream cone waivers, what you get out of that is this. That is Greece. That is what happens when you create positive rights in a state that is unable to adequately supply those things because of basic functions of economics, and you tell everyone they are allowed to have it, and then you let them fight over it like a bunch of savages. And the Constitution was supposed to avoid this problem. It's amazing that there was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. In the original Constitution, they voted it down unanimously. And if you think about some of the things I've said in this talk, it might make sense why they did. The basic reason why they did is that they actually thought they created a government so limited that a Bill of Rights would not be necessary.
Excuse me, Trevor.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left, so
2 minutes.
Whatever you want to do with the time is good.
All right, cool.
Yep.
So we're going to go this real quickly. The powers were so limited that the rights would be unnecessary or dangerous. The short form of this, I'm going to go through this really quickly here, is the Constitution is now averted, which essentially means that the original cause of the Constitution was a sea of power, was a sea of liberty with islands of power in it, and those islands of power were the limits of Congress's powers. But now we have a sea of power with islands of liberty in it. And those liberties are carve-outs and exemptions that are given to you by the Bill of Rights. And this is a quote we can get to later. And the conclusion here is that politics does suck. It invents problems that don't need to exist. It creates a different type of inequality, political inequality, and it creates different types of succeeding in the world. There we go.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking today. There wasn't any questions that any of the people typed in. Just so everybody knows, I will make sure.
I can stay on if anyone wants to ask a question.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. Okay. So here's a question. So you talked about the problems with the political system today a lot. What do you see? What do you see in the future, and what should students like us be advocating for or talking about besides just how bad things are?
Yeah, that's a good question. You should be talking about the positive nature of living in a world where you don't have to fight about this type of stuff. You still there? You still there?
Yes, yes, I'm still here.
Okay, you just killed. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should be talking about the virtues of living in a world where this doesn't have to happen. The problem that we have is we have to advocate against things in principle that seem really good at the beginning. So, for example, like the healthcare system that we talked about, that seems really nice, but essentially the inevitable result of that is the type of rioting and stuff that we talked about. So you have to be very positive about what it means to not, and I believe in that world. Like this is a very negative lecture, but there's a lot of positivism here when we say, don't politicize the world, or we're going to live in a really, really bizarre and tribalistic world.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that. And with that, thank you so much, Trevor, for and all the participants, obviously, for attending this evening. I hope you can all continue to come to the webinars and learn throughout the year. Our next webinar is next Wednesday. Oh, it's actually on February 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'm going to mess up his last name here, but it's Aram Seinrich from Rutgers University. And he'll be discussing the privacy crusade, how the music industry's war on sharing destroys markets and erodes civil liberties. And obviously you can go to our website and register for that. On a final note today, shortly you will be emailed a follow-up email, and you will find detailed information on internships in the movement and also a survey to evaluate our webinars and help us fill it out and improve our programs and the webinars for you guys. Also, yeah, with that, we are officially wrapped up. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and have a wonderful night, everyone.